It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And now this week, we see David asking, what can I do for others? And out of all the people in the world, who does he want to do something for? He wants to do something kind for Saul, or he wants to do something kind for King Saul's descendants. And that's because of his love for his friend Jonathan. And Saul and Jonathan, they've been dead for about 16 years now. And David has still not forgotten his friend or his commitment to Jonathan. But David, he doesn't know who's left from Saul's family. And you would kind of think, well, couldn't he just go ask his wife, Michal? But he doesn't. And I just figure they're probably still not talking. But the truth is, she probably doesn't know. But then David, he finds out about Ziba, who's the head servant of Saul's house. And so David, he calls Ziba to come to him, because he's a servant, because he has to, but he doesn't really like being a servant. And underneath it all, he has his own agenda, because Ziba, underneath the surface, he's trying to build his own house, because we find out that he has 15 sons and 20 servants of his own. So Ziba, he would rather be a master than the servant. But before King David, he'll always say and do the right things. And so they have this conversation, and David says, are you Ziba? And then David asks, and he says, is there not someone from the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness to? And the only reason that Ziba would be the only one who knew if Saul had any descendants left is because he was Saul's head servant. Because Mephibosheth, he's in hiding. And the reason that Mephibosheth is hiding is because it's customary for the new king to kill everyone from the former king's household and not to leave any heirs to the throne of the old king's dynasty. So here we have the most powerful man in Israel, if not the whole world, King David, and we see him do something that he never had to do. He's going to show kindness. And so here, David, he's going to go out of his way, and it's not to show kindness just to someone from his own family. And you have to realize, David, he has a large family because he has multiple wives, so that means he has their family. So he's got dozens of mother-in-laws and dozens of father-in-laws and brother-in-laws. He has dozens of children who could all benefit from his kindness. But here, he's looking for someone to show God's kindness to. And so he goes out of his way. And it's not necessarily to find a friend, because David, he's asking here if there's anyone from Saul's household, someone from the household of the man who chased him for 10 years and tried to have him put to death. Because right here, it doesn't seem that David, he even knew that Jonathan ever had a son. So David, he's just looking for anyone from Saul's household to show kindness to. And if you look at the phrase that David used, he says, to whom I may show the kindness of God. And Ziba tells David, there is someone, and it happens to be his best friend, Jonathan's son, who's lame in both his feet. So this is the same one that we read about earlier at the time of Ishbosheth's murder. And if you remember, he's the son of Saul that Abner made king. And if you remember, it was kind of odd how they were telling that story of Ishbosheth, and then Mephibosheth is mentioned right in the middle of Ishbosheth's story. But the reason that Mephibosheth was mentioned back then is because he's the last living heir of Saul. who just happens to be Jonathan's son, the one who became crippled in both of his feet when dropped by his nurse when fleeing after the death of Saul and Jonathan by the Philistines. Where the person that he would have been fleeing from would have been the new royal leader. He would be fleeing from the king that was to replace Saul. Because whoever that king was to be, they would be more than likely to execute any potential heir to the throne from Saul's dynasty, because that's what every king would do. And Jonathan, he was supposed to be the heir to Saul's throne, and Mephibosheth is his only son. So Mephibosheth is the firstborn son of the firstborn son of King Saul. And all the other rivals to the throne, they're now all dead. So Mephibosheth, he was hiding for his life. And that's why Ziba, Saul's servant, is the only one who knows where Mephibosheth is. And the only person Mephibosheth has been hiding from is King David, especially if he ever believed any of the things that his grandfather, King Saul, said about David. Where Saul, he said it was David who was the one who was going to try to seek his life and all the lives of all the royal family. He was always accusing David of trying to take the throne. And so it's very possible that Mephibosheth has feared and hated David from his very early childhood, where he may have blamed David for losing everything, for losing the throne and the land, and maybe even for having these crippled feet. Because if there was no David, they wouldn't have had to flee for their lives. But here, it really appears that David, that he never knew that his best friend Jonathan ever had a son. And so David, he sends for Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, he's now about 21 years old, and he's really not doing that well. Because David finds Mephibosheth living in a low place where he's not even living in his own home, where he's hiding for his life, staying at another man's house, the house of Machir in Lo-debar. And Lo-debar is very far from Jerusalem. It's on the east side of the Jordan River in Gilead. And Lo-debar, what it means, it literally means no pasture, which means this is a desolate place in the middle of nowhere. So he's a real nowhere man sitting in his nowhere land, making all his nowhere plans for nobody. That's Mephibosheth. And then that day comes that Mephibosheth feared his whole life. And David's messengers, they showed up at the door, and they're going to take him to David, to this man he hated his whole life, the one Mephibosheth may have believed killed his uncle Ishbosheth, because it was Ishbosheth's captains that actually killed his uncle, but they were thinking they were doing David a favor, because there were a lot of people who probably thought that way about David, because we'll see it later that he'll always be accused of taking Saul's throne by bloodshed. And here, there's nothing Mephibosheth can do, because he can't run. In fact, because he's crippled, they're going to have to carry him to David. And so this whole trip, he may have been thinking, I'm a dead man. And so they brought him before David. And Mephibosheth, he falls on his face before David, and he's laying prostrate, which would be very difficult for him to do because his legs are crippled. And he's laying there, not knowing what to expect, laying in a position as if he's begging for mercy. And the very first thing that David does is he puts this poor man at ease. And you have to realize that nothing that David says here to Mephibosheth is because he's crippled. For none of this is out of pity for Mephibosheth being handicapped. Where everything that's being said, that David says, is just out of his desire to show kindness. It has nothing to do with Mephibosheth. It all has to do with David's heart of who he is, because David is like Jesus Christ here. Because it's David who sought out Mephibosheth. And he sought him out to show him God's kindness. And it's not because of who Mephibosheth is or because he deserved it, because he didn't. David didn't even know he existed. And David, he did all of this while he was being mischaracterized by Mephibosheth, where David was hated and treated as an enemy. But David did it all out of his own love for his father, Jonathan, not for Mephibosheth. And this is the same for us. Jesus loved us while we were yet sinners, when we were the enemies of God, and where it was Jesus who sought us. And it wasn't because we're all so lovable, but it was because of his love for the Father, like in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. For Jesus, he isn't just the most powerful king in the world, but of the universe. And so David, he says to Mephibosheth, do not fear, for I will surely show you the kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul, your grandfather. So here, Mephibosheth, he hears something that he's never known before, where he finds out that everything that he's ever believed about David was a lie, that David was not out to kill him, but that David loved his father Jonathan. Many people think the same way about Jesus, where what they believe about Jesus is all a bunch of lies, where they're afraid of Jesus because they think that when Jesus catches up with them, he's going to judge them because he's out to kill them and he's going to send them to hell. But that's not true. It's like here where David tells Mephibosheth that he's going to restore all the things that he lost, where David is going to restore all of his grandfather Saul's property to him. And David is the only one who can do that, because when David became the king, everything that belonged to the former king, King Saul, it all became his. He gained all the king's property, and David can give it to whomever he wants to give it to. And that's what Jesus does for us. He restores to us all that's been lost to us by our father, Adam. And Jesus is the only one who can do that, because it was his when he received the kingdom from the former king of this world. And the former king of this world was the devil. And that was when he defeated the devil by his death on the cross. That's when Jesus received the title deed of the earth. And Jesus can give it to whomever he wills. And that's us. And then David says to Mephibosheth, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. And David says this to him 4 times in this passage. And this is like an informal adoption, where Mephibosheth is going to be like one of David's own sons, sitting around the table as a part of the family. Where with Jesus, we are actually adopted as sons, and we will eat at his table. All right, and so now Mephibosheth, he responds to David, and he's overwhelmed, and it's nothing like he thought, and he bows because he feels unworthy of David's generosity, because he is unworthy of David's generosity. But David, he's not doing this because of Mephibosheth's worthiness. It's all done out of David's own goodness. It has nothing to do with Mephibosheth. It's all out of David's own love for his father. And so Mephibosheth, he sees himself as a dead dog. And I don't see anything as worthless as a dead dog. I don't know anybody who wants one. And that's what we were. We were dead as dogs. And we too were lame. We might not have been lame in our feet, but we had no strength to save ourselves when Jesus came looking for us. Where we expected judgment, but instead we were invited to sit at his table as his sons. And it's a much higher table than the king's table, because we will be seated in heavenly places. And it's all because Jesus wanted to show us his kindness, because of who he is, who is much more powerful than King David. Where Jesus, he's just not ruling a kingdom, but he's ruling all of creation and beyond. And then David, he calls Ziba to tell him all this good news, that he gave Mephibosheth all of Saul's things back to him. And so now you work for him. So isn't this great? So all that profit that you were making for yourself on Saul's land, well, it's now all Mephibosheth. But hey, Mephibosheth, he's not going to be needing it because he'll be eating at my table like one of my sons. And this is where we learn that Ziba, he has his own family of 15 sons and 20 servants. And so I'm pretty sure he probably has some wives and he has some daughters too. So Ziba here, he has a very large family to take care of, but there's nothing he can do about this because he is Saul's servant. So Ziba tells King David that he'll do all that he's been commanded to do. But it's not like he's not going to be getting paid for it. It's just now he works for Mephibosheth along with the rest of his family. So things are basically back to the way they used to be before Saul died. And they all still have jobs. But Ziba, he's not that excited. And we'll see later how he tricks Mephibosheth out of half of his property. But here, he's not willing to disobey the king. And then we find out that Mephibosheth, that he also has a young son named Micah, and they both move to Jerusalem. All right, so now we begin chapter 10. And David here, he is still wanting to show his kindness. And this time, it's to another son of a king who has shown kindness to David when he needed it. And so what's going on here is that King Nahash, the king of Ammon, died. And so now his son Hanun is to rule in his place. And so David, he does what's decent and what's expected. He sends ambassadors from Israel to comfort him, which was common in those days, just like it's common in our days. When a great leader dies in a country, we'll send a delegation of respected men to pay tribute to their fallen leader. And I don't know if you remember who King Nahash was, but he hasn't always been that kind to Israel, because he's the same man that we saw back in 1 Samuel chapter 11, where Nahash gave the people of Jabesh Gilead a choice for each person to have their right eye gouged out, and then they could become his servants and become subject to him, or be destroyed by my army, which was the single event that caused King Saul to unify Israel under his new kingship. But now it appears that King Nahash has softened with age, and he had been kind to David at some point. And Jewish tradition here, it says that Nahash saved one of King David's brothers when fleeing from Moab when they put David's parents to death. And again, here we don't know if that's true because it doesn't say it here, but that is the Jewish tradition. But whatever kindness it was enough for David to send ambassadors to Ammon to tell the new king that we're sorry for your loss. And it was the right thing to do, just like it's the right thing to do today. And part of this is David reaching out to tell this new king, King Hanun, who's just starting his reign, that he doesn't have to worry about David, that he will keep the same covenant of peace with him that he had with his father. But what Hanun does here is wrong. And maybe it's just due to his inexperience or his immaturity, or maybe it's just because he has a bunch of lousy counselors. But they treat David like he's devious. They're accusing David of taking advantage of the hardship the country's going through, and that David is lying and he's spying out the land to attack. And the reason they probably had those thoughts is because that's probably what they would have done if the situation was reversed. And if they didn't want to receive David's ambassadors and didn't want them to come into the city, they could have just rejected him and turned them away at the gate. But rejecting David's kindness is one thing, but spitting in David's face and humiliating his ambassadors is another, because ambassadors, they always represent the one who sent them. And in this case, it's King David himself. And shaving off half of a man's beard in this culture would have been the greatest of insults, because this would be considered an attack on their manhood. And a shaven face in this culture was the mark of a slave. because all free men wore beards. And then they're cutting off the men's robes, and they're cutting them past their waist. So it's not only showing their buttocks, but other parts that should be kept covered. So this was showing their circumcision. And then they forced them all out into public to walk through their city, walking naked through their streets to go back to their homes. And so they're treating them as if they were prisoners of war. But these guys, they didn't go home. They went to Jericho. And Jericho at this time, it hadn't been rebuilt yet. So at this time, there would have only been like a few clusters of houses. And so when David hears, he goes down to them and he tells them to stay there till their beards grow in. And you would think, well, how could anyone repay such an act of kindness with that kind of wickedness, returning such evil for such good? But then you think again about Jesus Christ, who was the greatest ambassador of peace, who came from heaven, who came to comfort us. And they didn't just shave off half his beard. They pulled it out by the handfuls. And they didn't just cut off his robe. They stripped him naked and they nailed him to a cross so he could watch them gamble for the clothes that they stole. Because in this world, it's not uncommon for men to treat kindness with wickedness and to scorn people who come to comfort them, for the people who come to bring them peace. And we see that all the time because as Christians, we see that Christians are martyred all the time, trying to bring God's peace to the people. But even after this great insult to David here, he doesn't fly off the handle and he doesn't go down to attack him, but they know that they have made themselves repulsive to David. But they don't try to apologize or to make any amends. But what they do is they make a declaration of war and hire a bunch of mercenaries, a bunch of Syrians from the north to attack David. And it's 32,000 Syrian mercenaries. And so David, he didn't even go to attack him, and he didn't leave until he heard this. And once he heard this, then he sent Joab out with the entire army. And on Joab's way down toward Ammon, Joab and his army, they get caught between the two armies, with the Syrians on the north and Ammon on the south. So he has enemies in front of him and behind him, where many people would have been forced or feel forced to have to surrender because they're surrounded. Because it's too hard to fight a battle on two fronts. But Joab, we've never, ever seen him retreat from any battle. And so what he does is he divides the army, and he takes the smaller army of the most experienced to fight against the Syrians. And he gives his brother Abishai the majority of the men to fight against Ammon. And then Joab, he makes this great speech, which has 3 points to it. Be of good courage and let us be strong. Second point, because we're doing this for our people in the city of God. And then the third, and let the Lord do what's good in his sight, which means we'll do what we can, but we'll leave the outcome in the Lord's hand. And if you read here, it never says that Joab ever engaged them in battle, but that the Syrians, that they just fled before him. And then when the Ammonites saw the Syrians fleeing, they fled. And then after this, Joab, he gathers the whole army and he gets them together to fight against the Syrians. And he left the Ammonites to fight them on another day.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,